Tears streamed down Sierra's face as she stood before the judge. "Please, Your Honor, just look at the evidence." But the judge barely glanced at her until something happened that no one in that courtroom expected. The courtroom was stifling, not from the heat but from the unbearable weight of injustice pressing down on Sierra Thompson's chest. Tall windows let in slants of harsh midday light, illuminating the polished mahogany benches and the indifferent faces of those who sat upon them. The air smelled of old books, ink, and the faint scent of coffee from the stenographer's desk. It was the kind of place where lives were decided in a matter of minutes, where people like her were more often unheard than understood. Sierra's hands trembled as she clutched the stack of papers in front of her, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had rehearsed this moment over and over, whispering her arguments to herself in the quiet of her tiny apartment, hoping that somehow today would be different. Her son's future depended on it. She took a deep breath and looked up at the man who held his fate in his hands. Judge Whitaker barely glanced at her, his deep-set eyes lined with impatience. His silver hair, neatly combed back, gave him an air of wisdom. But Sierra saw nothing but dismissal behind those cold, calculating eyes. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a finger against the armrest as though waiting for her to finish her little speech so he could move on to more important cases. "Your Honor, please," Sierra's voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "Just look at the evidence. My son is innocent." A scoff echoed from the prosecution's table. Sierra turned her head just enough to catch the smirk on the prosecutor's lips. James Calloway, a man known for his ruthless ambition. He didn't care about justice. He cared about his conviction. About climbing the ladder in a system built to favor men like him. And he had already made up his mind. "This court has already reviewed the evidence, Ms. Thompson," Judge Whitaker said, his voice smooth but distant, like someone discussing numbers, not a life. "The jury has heard the arguments. You need to accept the reality of the situation." Sierra's fingers curled into fists. Reality? Reality was that her son Jordan, a bright 17-year-old with dreams of college, had been arrested based on nothing more than an unreliable witness statement. Reality was that despite a clear alibi, despite the gaping holes in the prosecution's case, no one cared enough to look deeper. Reality was that the world had already decided he was guilty because of the color of his skin. Sierra took a step forward, her voice rising. "Your Honor, I have new evidence. If you would just—" Judge Whitaker let out a long sigh, rubbing his temple. "Ms. Thompson, we cannot continue entertaining every last minute. Please." Sierra's voice cracked, the desperation spilling over. "Now, just look at it." For the first time, the courtroom fell silent. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few murmurs rose from the audience. Sierra's chest heaved as she fought back the sob threatening to escape her throat. She had never felt so small, so powerless. She was a mother begging for her child's freedom, and they were treating her like a nuisance. Judge Whitaker exhaled sharply. "I've heard enough." He reached for his gavel. Sierra's heart dropped. Then something happened. A voice, a low, steady voice, cut through the tense air. "Wait." Every head in the room turned, and in that moment Sierra knew the game had just changed. The courtroom hummed with quiet anticipation. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. It should have felt warm, but for Sierra Thompson it was cold, sterile, suffocating. She stood beside her son, her fingers tightening around the stack of papers in her hands. This wasn't just evidence, it was her last hope. Across the room, Judge Whitaker sat high above them, his face impassive, his gavel resting like a silent threat. He had seen cases like this before: black defendant, tearful mother, a prosecutor eager to close another file. To him, this was routine. Sierra could see it in his eyes. He had already decided. She stole a glance at Jordan, her son, barely 17, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit. He sat stiffly, his hands folded on the table, his face a mask of quiet fear. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, But he held his head high. She had raised him to be strong, to be kind, to believe in justice. But the world had other plans. The prosecutor, James Calloway, leaned back in his chair, exuding confidence. His smirk barely concealed his satisfaction. This was an easy win for him. The evidence was thin, the witness unreliable. But none of that mattered. The system was on his side. It always had been. Sierra's pulse pounded in her ears as Calloway began his argument, painting Jordan as a dangerous delinquent, a menace to society. He spoke with the ease of a man who had never been questioned, never had to fight for the truth. And when Sierra finally stood to speak, her voice cut through the heavy air. "Your Honor, if you would just look at the evidence." Judge Whitaker sighed, barely concealing his impatience. "Mrs. Thompson, the court has already reviewed." "No." Her voice was sharp, unwavering. "You haven't." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Calloway's smirk faltered. Sierra stepped forward, holding up a small flash drive. "I have security footage," she said. "Footage that proves my son wasn't anywhere near that convenience store." Silence. For the first time, Judge Whitaker hesitated. The confidence in Calloway's eyes flickered. Sierra took a deep breath and met their stares head-on. "You assumed he was guilty the moment he walked into this courtroom," she said. "But today you're going to listen." And with that, she plugged the drive into the courtroom screen. The truth was about to shatter everything. Sierra's hands trembled as she inserted the flash drive into the courtroom screen. The large monitor flickered to life, but before the video could even load, Judge Whitaker let out a long, tired sigh. "Ms. Thompson," he said, rubbing his temples as if she were a nuisance rather than a desperate mother fighting for her son's life. "This court does not have time for baseless accusations." Baseless. The word stung sharp and dismissive. Sierra's heart pounded against her ribs. She had spent weeks gathering this evidence, endless nights replaying every moment, chasing down leads, convincing a reluctant store owner to give her the footage that would exonerate her son. And now, with a single wave of his hand, the judge was ready to erase it all. "Your Honor, this is surveillance footage from the night of the crime," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "It proves my son wasn't there." Judge Whitaker didn't even look at the screen. He simply turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Calloway, do you have any objections?" Calloway, still lounging in his chair, smirked. "Your Honor, this is nothing but a last-minute attempt to distract from the facts. The state has already built a strong case against the defendant. This," he gestured lazily toward the screen, "changes nothing." Sierra clenched her fists. Jordan, sitting beside her, barely breathed. His fingers were intertwined so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. He had stopped hoping for fairness the moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, but Sierra hadn't. "Your Honor, I am begging you," she said, stepping closer to the bench. "At least look at it. That's all I ask." Whitaker shook, his head uninterested. "This trial has gone on long enough. I see no reason to delay further." Sierra opened her mouth to argue, but the sound of shuffling feet made her pause. The jury. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged glances. A young woman in the front row furrowed her brows, hesitant. Not all of them were convinced of Jordan's guilt, but none of them were willing to speak up. Sierra's chest tightened. They would sit there silent and unsure, while her son's life was decided for him. She looked back at the judge, a man who had likely never questioned his own authority a day in his life. He had seen so many cases like hers, so many black mothers crying for sons who never got a fair chance, and he had learned to tune them out. But Sierra wasn't just another pleading voice. She would not be silenced. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. If they weren't going to listen willingly, she would have to force them to, because the truth was staring them all in the face, and she was about to make damn sure they saw it. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom, suffocating, stretching into eternity. Judge Whitaker's gavel hovered over his desk, just moments away from sealing Jordan's fate. His expression was one of complete disinterest, as if this case was nothing more than a formality, Another black boy slipping through the cracks of the system. Sierra's pulse thundered in her ears. No, not this time. Before the gavel could drop, she took a bold step forward, her voice shaking but strong. "You won't listen to me, Your Honor," she said, meeting his gaze without fear. "Then listen to this." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Sierra reached for the laptop connected to the projector. Her hands were steady now, fueled by something stronger than fear. With a firm click, she pressed play. The screen flickered to life. At first, nothing happened, just grainy footage of a quiet street. A few people walked past a convenience store, bundled up against the night air. The timestamp in the corner showed 8:43 p.m., the exact time the crime had taken place, miles away. And then, there he was, Jordan. He was walking out of the store, a bag of snacks in one hand, his phone in the other. The camera caught his face clearly as he paused to greet someone off-screen, laughing at something they said. A wave of gasps swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor, who had spent the entire trial smirking with arrogant confidence, suddenly stiffened in his seat, the color drained from his face. The video rolled on. 4:45 p.m. Jordan was still there, standing by the curb, waiting for a bus. The same bus that surveillance footage from another location had already confirmed picked him up minutes later. 50 p.m. The crime was happening at that very moment, across town. The prosecutor's case had just crumbled into dust. The room buzzed, with whispers, shock rippling through the spectators. Even the jurors who had sat in quiet indifference now leaned forward, their eyes flicking between the screen and Jordan. For the first time, doubt sank in. For the first time, they saw what Sierra had been screaming all along. Judge Whitaker's grip on his gavel tightened. His face, once stone-cold and unreadable, now twitched with something Sierra had never seen before. Panic. Because he had been so ready to dismiss her, so ready to sentence her son. And now, the truth was staring him in the face, undeniable and damning. Sierra watched him carefully. Would he admit his mistake, or would he still try to bury the truth? For a moment, the courtroom was utterly still. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector, the frozen frame of the surveillance video casting a ghostly glow across the judge's bench. Jordan's face, clear and unmistakable, was still visible on the screen, now irrefutable proof of his innocence. Then chaos erupted. Gasps turned into murmurs. Murmurs turned into whispers, growing louder and louder until they swelled into a storm of shock and outrage. The jury shifted in their seats, glancing at one another with wide, uncertain eyes. A woman in the back row shook her head, muttering under her breath. Even the court stenographer, who had been mechanically typing away throughout the trial, paused, her fingers hovering hesitantly over the keys. Sierra could hear it all, the shifting, the disbelief, the weight of realization finally settling over the room like a suffocating fog. And then there was the prosecutor. His face had gone ghostly pale, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. This proves nothing, he stammered, scrambling to regain control of the narrative. The footage could be tampered with. It came from a city-owned surveillance camera. Sierra interrupted sharply, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. She had been silent for too long, forced to listen as they painted her. Son is a criminal, not anymore. The timestamps match, the records match. My son was nowhere near the crime scene and you knew it. You just didn't care enough to look. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sierra turned her gaze to the judge. Judge Whitaker had been silent through it all. His gavel lay forgotten on his desk, his hands clenched together as he stared at the screen. The arrogance, the condescension that had laced his voice every time Sierra had spoken, every time he had dismissed her as nothing more than an emotional mother, was gone. For the first time, he looked at her, really looked at her, not as a nuisance, not as a desperate woman grasping at straws, but as a mother who had been screaming for justice while everyone else had tried to silence her. Sierra saw something flicker in his expression, hesitation, shame, something deeper. a crack in the carefully built walls of his authority. But it was too late for second thoughts now. With the entire courtroom watching, with every pair of eyes fixed on him, waiting for his response, Judge Whitaker let out a slow, shaky breath. His fingers curled, pressing into the desk as if steadying himself. Then finally his voice came, less certain than before. He cleared his throat. This evidence demands a full review. A stunned silence swept over the room. The same judge who had dismissed Sierra, who had been so eager to push this case through without a second glance, was now forced to backpedal. Forced to admit, however reluctantly, that he had been wrong. That he had failed to listen. The prosecutor tensed beside him, his face twisting in barely concealed rage. But there was nothing he could do now. The damage was done. The truth was out. Sierra felt her knees go weak. For the first time in weeks, for the first time since this nightmare had begun, she felt something close to relief. She wasn't just another black woman being ignored in a system that was designed to work against her. She had made them listen. And Jordan, her son, her baby, might finally have a chance at freedom. The weight of the moment pressed down on the courtroom like an unbearable storm. The once commanding voice of Judge Whitaker had wavered, and now, silence followed his reluctant admission. Sierra stood frozen, her breath shallow. Was this it? Was this the moment she had fought so hard for? Her son's defense attorney, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a quiet determination, wasted no time. He stood, his chair scraping against the polished floor as he addressed the court. "Your Honor," he said firmly, his voice steady and unshaken. "In light of this indisputable evidence, the defense formally requests that all charges against Jordan Thompson be dropped immediately. This young man should never have been here in the first place." The room remained tense, everyone waiting for the judge's response. Judge Whitaker stared at the screen, his fingers drumming against the wooden bench. He looked smaller than before, his usual towering authority cracked under the weight of the truth he could no longer ignore. He had dismissed Sierra, ignored her pleas, allowed a system built on bias to swallow an innocent boy whole. And now, there's no way out. With a slow inhale, he straightened in his seat. This court acknowledges the new evidence and agrees that the charges should be dismissed. His voice was heavy, as if the words burned on the way out. Jordan Thompson is hereby declared innocent, and this case is dismissed with immediate effect. For a second, no one moved. Then the words settled, and Sierra collapsed. Not out of weakness, not out of exhaustion, but out of sheer, overwhelming relief. She gasped, her knees giving way, but before she could hit the ground, strong arms caught her. Jordan's arms, her son, her innocent, terrified, beautiful boy who had been shackled by a lie and nearly condemned by a system that saw his skin before it saw his humanity. Jordan pulled her close, holding her as she sobbed against his chest. "It's over," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's over, baby, you're free." Jordan exhaled, a shuddering breath that carried weeks of fear, of hopelessness. He squeezed his mother tighter. "I knew you'd save me, Mom," the courtroom murmured in hushed tones, and though there were no cheers, this wasn't the kind of place for celebration. Sierra could feel the shift in the air. Some jurors looked ashamed, others stunned. Even the reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads seemed shaken, but not the prosecutor. Sierra turned her gaze to him, and there it was, the fury, the resentment burning in his narrowed eyes. He had wanted this conviction, needed it. Another easy case, another notch in his belt, another young black boy buried by a system that thrived on winning, not justice. But today, he had lost. Today, truth had won. Sierra held her head high as she took Jordan's hand and walked him out of the courtroom. The fight wasn't over. The weight of injustice still lingered, pressing against her shoulders like an unshakable force. But so did something else, the power of never giving up. The courtroom emptied, but Judge Whitaker remained seated, his fingers interlocked, his gaze fixed on the polished wooden bench before him. The gavel that once felt like an extension of his authority now felt heavier than ever. The door closed, behind Sierra and Jordan, their footsteps fading down the long marble hallway. The quiet that followed was deafening. For the first time in years, Judge Whitaker felt the weight of his own judgments. He had seen countless cases like this before, black mothers pleading for their sons. Some sobbed, others shouted, but all of them had one thing in common. They were desperate for someone to listen, and he never had. He had dismissed them with the same cold indifference, reducing their anguish to background noise in a courtroom that had never truly belonged to them. But Sierra, she had stood her ground, unshaken, unwavering, armed with nothing but her conviction and the truth. And when the truth finally spoke, it was undeniable. The prosecutor stormed out of the courtroom earlier, his face red with frustration, his case shattered. He had built his career on easy convictions, on playing to biases, on knowing the system would always tip in his favor. But not today. Today, a mother had fought back. Today, the truth had been louder than the system designed to bury. Judge Whitaker exhaled, running a hand over his weary face. His mind raced through years of rulings, past cases, names he barely remembered but lives he had altered forever. How many had been innocent? How many times had he refused to listen? A chill ran through him. The thought was unsettling. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel powerful behind the bench. He felt exposed, the weight of it all pressed against his chest, suffocating. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps just this once, he could let this moment change him. As the final echoes of Sierra's voice lingered in his mind, a realization settled deep in his bones. Justice wasn't given. It was fought for. And sometimes the most powerful evidence wasn't in legal documents or courtroom arguments. It was in a mother's unshakable belief in her child. How many voices do we silence before we finally listen?